but there is reason to think that maybe there's something in it, because for our subscribers, we're going to be talking to a very well-respected researcher, Jerry Zeitlin, who may have encountered such a being in a casino in Laughlin, Nevada. And as you listen, you'll find there are reasons why they might show up in such places. It's all very bizarre and very strange, but nevertheless, I would not have kept an open mind about what happened to me if it hadn't happened to me. So believe you me, I'm keeping an open mind about Charles Hall. We'll be right back.
You are listening to Whitley Strieber's Dreamland online and on the IBC Radio Network.
Today we're talking to Charles Hall and Jerry Zeitlin. Charles is a most interesting gentleman. He was on Coast in January, I believe, talking about something he calls the Tall Whites. And it's a story we're going to get into in a slightly different way, as you may imagine, from you have heard it before on Coast, because of the fact that I come from a similar background in a way, and that I've had close encounters as well, although never with this particular these particular beings. Joining us also is Jerry Zeitlin. Jerry is the I don't know, we call some people denizens of their websites, and his website and his organization is openseti.org. It's a wonderful organization. It places pressure on SETI to change its whole methodology, to open itself to the possibility of contact. And in view of the fact that Seth Shostak was recently at the Bohemian Grove in Northern California, claiming that abductees were probably the victims of spousal abuse, they're far from where you want them to be, Jerry, I would think.
Well, we certainly are, and Malou, my wife Malou, has an article about that on our website that we put up in the last week. It's really shocking that he can raise that specter of spousal abuse. There's so many questions that raises. We just couldn't leave that one alone.
Well, no.
We rarely go after individuals from Open SETI, but this one was just impossible to ignore.
Well, yeah, and Seth Shostak is I don't know, I think since I'm not a member of SETI, and I don't care whether I go after people or not, I think the simplest word to describe him would be creep. And so that's my reading of the validity of him as a person, and I think that SETI is a waste of time and money, frankly.
If you actually if you find the article linked from our homepage, and then within that article at the very top, you'll get to a news story about what Seth Shostak said. He has his own picture there, and there's a little bit of a background on him. And you don't really have to explain why he's a creep. All you have to do is read his own stuff, and it comes out loud and clear. But we do have other information about Seth Shostak. I'm just waiting for the right moment.
Well,
he's as bad as you think.
Of course, to be honest, we're going to be talking here today not about Seth Shostak and SETI, which is but you talk about pouring from the empty into the void. It's a waste of time to even think about them, in my opinion. Although, thank goodness, there are people like Jerry and Malou Zeitlin out there keeping them honest, or keeping them at least calling them to task. They can't be kept honest because they're not honest. Now, Charles, I want to get into the Tall Whites, and I want to begin with your beginning with this, and not quite with when you first encountered them, but you went for a long time without even mentioning their existence to your wife. What was the process that brought you to change your position and to begin to talk about this?
Well, to begin with, the first time I mentioned it to my wife was shortly after we were married in 1970. We had been, my wife and I were married in November 1969, and we were in Sacramento, California, and we went to a party. And on the way, and at the party, people I'd been a weather observer in the Air Force, and I'd been stationed at Nellis and at Indian Springs, Nevada, and also in Vietnam. And at the party, some of the other members of the party had implied that that Air Force guys and stuff that they had pretty easy duty. And on the way home, I began telling my wife about the tall white aliens that I had encountered out in the deserts north of Indian Springs, because it was a very emotional experience. As you remember, the 1970s, 60s and 70s. That was, at a time when UFOs were supposed to be swamp gas. And after I told my wife some of my experiences, she said that she what she cared about was how she should behave if she ever met one. And so really my wife, there wasn't actually a long time frame that I wasn't, before I told my wife. When I was in the Air Force, I enlisted in the Air Force in July of 1964, and I went to Vietnam in May of 1967, and I was discharged in May of 1968. There was never a time that I wasn't telling the people around me. It's just that I found that trying to capture the emotion of how it was to be out there in the desert and encounter the extraterrestrials, and I found that I couldn't really capture that emotion and convey it to my listeners or to the people I was talking with using the spoken word, and that's why eventually I came to write my books.
Well, it's an interesting statement, because it's also a very familiar problem to me, one I was just been wrestling with in the past few days, when I've begun to try to describe, I think, is a much more appropriate word on my website, because I can't document things that have happened to me in recent years, things that are so fundamentally different from what we think of as experience that it's impossible to describe. But let me now ask you this. We'll lead into this slowly. Where did you came back from Vietnam? You had no idea about these creatures in Vietnam, I would guess. Is that true? Or
no. In May of 1964, I enlisted in the U.S. Air Force, and in July of 1964, I enlisted in the U.S. Air Force, and I was sent to Lackland Air Force Base, San Antonio, for my basic training. In those days, we still did 13 weeks. And so I was at Lackland through July, August, September 1964. I remember there was a really bad, just a terrible thunderstorm in September of '64, and I was walking area guard that night during the storm. It tore up a big tree. I got an award for walking area guard, while the other area guards got a couple weeks in the brig for hiding under the tree because the storm was so horrible. And then, when they get, how the Air Force gives you tests to see what you're good at, and I got a perfect score in logical reasoning, inductive reasoning and deductive reasoning, and I also got only one wrong in the math ability test, which was 500 questions, much harder than the graduate record exam. And so I was supposed to be in a security job, radio intercept analysis. So me and two of my friends did PATS standings, waiting for our security clearance to come through. My clearance came through, but the guy that was the clerk at the squadron office screwed up my orders and instead gave me the cover orders, which were to go to weather school at Chanute instead of to go to security school at San Angelo, Texas. And so after I'd been at Chanute for 2 months, and I hadn't been paid because I had 2 copies of my orders, but nobody knew I was there. You know how the military is. I had copies of my orders so I could go out and get in the airplane and all that stuff, but really I was supposed to be off at San Angels. I went down to the base, to the accountant office, and I said, asked why I wasn't getting paid. And the next day at weather school, 2 MPs showed up with the dogs, actually, and took me off to the base commander's office, and he stood me up there and he said, Airman Hall, if you have a set of orders showing that you're supposed to be on this base, then you're a happy man, and the captain who gave them to you will get 5 years in Leavenworth. you're too valuable a man to be risked in weather school. And if you don't have a copy of your orders, then the captain will be a happy man, and you'll get 5 years in Leavenworth. You're too valuable a man to be risked here in weather school. And I had 2 copies. I was real fast. I had them on my wallet, and I was real fast at giving him a copy. And so then they sent me back to weather school and gave the captain, and the captain that was supposed to have given me the real orders, he, as I understand it, he was court-martialed. And so then they sent me to Nellis Air Force Base outside Las Vegas. I finished weather observing school, and at the time, so I got in Nellis in March of '65, and at the time, weather observers did 6 weeks TDY and rotated between Nellis and the Nellis gunnery ranges at Indian Springs, and at the time, they all came back. With stories. One was the legend of Range 4 Harry, which I talk about in book 1. But you weren't supposed. I wasn't supposed to be in the rotation scheme till I finished my on-the-job training, which usually takes like several months. And I got there in March, and in late April, of the same year when I was at Nellis, my commander. They called him over to the base commander called him over to his office one day and said the Pentagon wants Charlie to be sent next. And I remember when the major, when he came back from the base commander's office, he was looking kind of stunned or shocked, and he was saying, gee, you have friends in the Pentagon, and of course, I just grew up in Wisconsin. I didn't seem to me like I had a friend anywhere. And so they put me in the rotation scheme and sent me to Indian Springs in May of '65. And over the course of the next 2 years, from May of '65 till I left for Vietnam in May of '67, I spent most of that time out on the ranges at Indian Springs, and my books document that experience. Everything in my books is true. It's as true as I can make it. The only thing I changed were the names of the people and the places to protect the innocent. I had to change a few distances and a few directions because I didn't want to upset the Pentagon. My purpose in writing the books was to capture how it felt to be out there in the desert and to encounter the tall white extraterrestrials, just stone cold. And the emotions that went with that, and that's what I'm trying to convey to the reader.
Why was the Air Force involved with them at all?
They have a base out in the Indian Springs Valley that the Air Force maintains the outer perimeter, and they treat it like a foreign embassy. Everything inside the inner perimeter is the tall whites and whatever they want to do. When you're you'll notice on Jerry Zeitlin's website, we try to, if you look at his website, you'll see the general location of the base. When you're at Indian Springs, Nevada, and you're looking straight north up the valley, the mountains on the horizon, if you look, and you're looking at those mountains, if you look at those straight north and a little bit to the east, that's Area 54. And if you look straight up the valley and a little bit to the west, that's Area 53. That's Dreamland. Dreamland also is the mountains on the eastern side of the valley and in the desert game range over by Dogbone Lake and that. And a few of the sections on the western side of the valley, on the mountains between Indian Springs Valley and Area 52, which is Papoose Lake. And my orders allowed me to go up into that area anytime I wanted, day or night. The only rule was that whatever I did, I had to do alone. If I took anyone with me, I wouldn't be in trouble, but whoever was with me might be shot. As you see, my orders did not permit my commanders to even come out to inspect the weather station. And like if my first sergeant, if he came out, say like to deliver paperwork or something, he had to come with another sergeant, and the only place on Indian Springs that they were allowed to meet me was physically in the parking lot of the chow hall. They were not even allowed to come into my barracks, even though I was the only one in the barracks. Because as you see in the books, the tall whites typically came into my barracks too. And
why was this segregation so necessary? Why did they want it to? What's the reason for it?
Well, as you see in my books, the tall whites, when they first arrive here on Earth, they are naturally as afraid of us as we are of them.
Do you know why?
Well, as you see in my books, they're physically more frail than we are. Range 4 Harry himself, Range 4 Harry was the name that his so-called CIA name, the name he used so that humans could address him, because his actual name a human couldn't pronounce, and they all took on such names. One time he was walking in some soft dirt over by the Range 3 lounge, and after he had left, I measured the depths of his footprints. He was the same height I am, 5'11", 6 feet tall, but he only weighed between 90 and 110 pounds. And see, like if a human were to ever just say shake his hand or give him a good hard handshake or slap him on the shoulder, gee, you'd be breaking bones all over the place, and he might never heal. When the aliens are around humans, the new arrivals are so afraid of us that some new arrivals physically wouldn't come closer than a quarter mile out in the desert.
We have to take a little break now, Charles.
Sure.
In fact, we're late on the break. So this is Whitley
Sure.
Strieber. It's Dreamland. We'll be right back. This is Whitley Strieber. It's Dreamland. We're back with Charles Hall and the Tall Whites and Jerry Zeitlin listening in. Jerry's going to be joining us in more detail when we go to the subscriber interview later on. And we are talking right now about the Tall Whites and their frailty and their fear of us. And I of course, have had a load of experience, not only with the Greys, but with a couple of other types of being, which in varying degrees were more human-looking. And what do the Tall Whites look like?
Well, you'll see on my website there's a couple of drawings.
And let me just, folks, I haven't said his website address yet. It's millennialhospitality.net. That's Millennial Hospitality, MILLENNIAL, and then the word hospitality all run together. And then it's a .net, not a .com. Okay, so go ahead, Charles.
Sure. The Tall Whites, they have men, women, and children. And throughout most of their adult life, they're about the same height as I am, 5'11", 6 feet tall. Their skin is as white as a piece of paper. They have larger eyes than a human. Their eyes are about twice the size of those of a human. Their nose and ears are much less prominent than those of a human. They have much less hair than a human. They have almost no hair on their arms, and they have and the hair on their head. They only have about half as much hair on their head as a human. They don't actually have enough hair in their head to part, and their hair is so transparent that sometimes it looks like they're all platinum blonde. On the other hand, because it's so thin, and they wear helmets and stuff, with their suits and that, or they sometimes wear them, as you see in my books, it's not unusual for the Tall Whites to have their hair cut real short, and so sometimes it may look as though they don't actually have hair, or until you get close to them. Now they have their thumbs are only about half as long as the human thumb, and their fingers are far more flexible than human fingers, and so they do far more just using the four fingers than a human does. And their arms are not meant, like our hands. We're built, to grab onto things with our hands and lift and throw and stuff. Their arms and hands are more frail than that. And so they don't have like contact sports, or they don't like push and shove and stuff like that. They live about 10 times longer than a human, so they live about 700 years. But this also means that if they break a bone, say like if they break a leg or if they scratch themselves, it takes them roughly 10 times longer to heal up than it does for a human, especially here on Earth. They consider the Earth to be a cold, desolate wilderness. And for them, as you see in Book 1, the one little boy who, where the one airman threw a rock and broke his arm, he couldn't actually heal up here on Earth. He had to go back to a place that was warmer with a higher air pressure. The same way that if we were injured in, say, Antarctica, we'd have to come back to a warmer climate to make it easier for us to heal up. But I estimated that their nervous system runs at least 2.5 or 3 times faster than a human. And as you see in Book 1, one of the first events one of the early events in '65 was the night that the teacher and one of the guards, I believe it was Range 4 Harry, and he was actually one of their communication officers, and 3 children were in my barracks. And when I saw them run out from my barracks out into Indian Springs Valley, and I timed them, the teacher and the children were running between 27 and 30 miles per hour. And Range 4 Harry himself, or the guard, when he was running out there, he was running at almost 35 miles an hour. And of course, that's because, for that reason, I say their nervous system runs much faster than a human nervous system, because humans, can't run anywhere near that fast. And they have a very dry sense of humor. They had to teach themselves to speak English. And they also had a helmet where they could communicate with you electronically. If there was just one of you, if there was like a group of people, then the electronic communications would get screwed up because each human is slightly different. But if a guard showed up, say like an experienced guard that was used to being around humans, if he showed up with some new arrivals, as frequently happened, and if he didn't happen to speak English or to have his electronic equipment turned on, then the only way you could communicate with them would be by hand signals. But they could learn to speak English so well that, as you see in my books, they were perfectly capable of calling me up on the telephone at my weather shack and sounding like any person they felt like sounding like. Their hearing
why were they interested in you at all? What I'm not understanding is what the relationship was. If they're here and it's a sort of transitional base, it would seem like they wouldn't have any need to interface with us at all.
Well, they only came when there was something in it for them. And because they have men, women, and children, the children and the women would get very bored up on the mountain, while the men were typically off repairing spacecraft or doing what men do. And they'll do anything for their children. They love their children way more than, say, humans love human children. And so about half of the time, one of the most common reasons for them to come down to where I was for the children to play. As the weather observer, I had these pretty colored balloons, and at night I would put lights on them and release them, and then I would track them with my theodolite. And about half the time, they would bring the children down to look through the theodolite and see the balloons. So about half the time, it's kind of like I'm the guy at the park where the kids like to play. And another reason was because in the technology transfer program between the tall whites and the Americans, many new arrivals had never seen a human before. And what they would like to do is to come down and practice just being close to a human to overcome their fear of humans, or to get used to dealing with humans prior to actually meeting with the U.S. Air Force generals or with the scientists or the people that the quality folk, And of course, I was just an enlisted man and just the weatherman.
Let me just take a little break here, Charles. This is Whitley Strieber's Dreamland. We're back talking to Charles Hall, his website, millennialhospitality.net. Jerry Zeitlin, who will be with us in the subscriber section, is listening in And Jerry's website is openseti.com, and you can
.org.
.org. I'm sorry, Jerry, and you can go to /Hall to see what they've got up about Charles Hall and the Tall Whites. Charles, let me ask you this: how long have they been here?
Well, I'm not sure, but you'll see in book 3 where the teacher was talking about the tall white lady who called herself Pamela. She said that Pamela had been born in Indian Springs Valley when James Madison was president, which was in 1812, back in that time frame.
Did they interact with the Indians?
I have no idea, but I note that the ancient Greeks, because even though I have a master's degree now in nuclear physics and a master's in business administration, history is one of my hobbies and always has been. I note that the ancient Greek legends that date from like 972 BC, when the Greeks learned to write in 975 BC, I guess, or I'm told. I note that the ancient Greeks called the star Arcturus the Watcher Star, because the men of ancient Greece said that in the summertime, on warm summer nights, when they were camping out in the mountains and the slopes of Mount Olympus, that a group of tall white gods would come and stand around the fireplace and watch them. And they said that those gods had come from Arcturus. And I note that one night when I was out at Range 3 and there was a group of tall white aliens standing around me, and they each had names, and I noted that I mentioned the star Arcturus, and they all got real nervous. But if I mentioned other stars like Canopus or Polaris, usually they didn't get nervous, or if they did, it might be one here or one there. But when you mentioned Arcturus, you'd have them all fluttering like chickens. And I note that when I looked at my records in the Weather Shack, that the legend of Range 4 Harry, I could trace that back to at least 1954, and maybe as early as 1951. And I note that according to my weather records that I had at the time, more than 41 weather observers before me had been stationed there, and they had all been compromised. Many had
compromised? What do you mean?
Many had become so afraid of the ranges that they wouldn't actually drive out and take the weather report. They would just stay in the chow hall in the morning and physically make up the winds and phone Nelson and pretend.
Why afraid?
Because the tall whites had come. Every one of them had said that Range 4 Harry had come when they were out there, and they were terrified of him. The tall whites, as you see in my book, the legend of Range 4 Harry was that he was supposed to be a radioactive white floating horse, but really it was the tall whites out tobogganing or having fun. But as you see in book 2, the tall whites had something I called the high-speed horse formation when they would wear these suits. The suits would allow them to float, and if they stood together like 2 adults in the front, 3 children in the middle, and 2 adults in the back, and had the children ride higher than the adults so that it would look like a horse out in the distance, especially since the ones in the front would bend over because they would be steering the formation.
Why would they get into such a formation?
Well, one time for the fun of it, one night I saw them playing on the runways at Indian Springs, and they were doing like tobogganists do. They were reaching speeds of between 80 and 100 miles an hour, just going up and down the runways having fun, the way humans go out and use toboggans or go out and ski. That was one of the things
they weren't concerned about their frailty.
Yes. As you see in my books, the tall whites, when they came around at night, would typically be wearing these suits that that allowed them to float. The suits put out a zone of fluorescent a few inches deep, depending on how what the power that was delivered to the suit. And the suit protected them from things. So, for example, if you were to throw a rock at them when they were wearing the suit, and I speak from direct experience, the rock would never get there. It would get, once it got into that zone of fluorescence, it would be like it was going into molasses, and it would just stop and then fall to the ground. And they were so used to wearing the suit that if you did that, they wouldn't flinch or anything. Now, as you see in Book 3, as you know, I have a master's degree in nuclear physics, and I have a theory called Hall photon theory, which is and you'll see in this appendix of Book 3, I describe Hall photon theory, and it is my belief that there's more to physics than what Einstein and his friends were aware of, because I'm certain that the tall white spacecraft came here routinely traveling faster than the speed of light, and that those suits allowed the tall whites to float. It allowed their spacecraft to float, and by putting out anti-gravity. And in Hall photon theory, what I try to do is I describe my theory is that inside a photon of light that there's a third as yet unrecognized field, that a photon of light, instead of being two fields, the electromagnetic field, that there's a third field in there, and that the field that surrounded those suits was that field, amplified and magnified. And I describe how I feel that scientists should look at famous experiments like the Michelson-Morley experiment and the Waterfield telescope experiment and at toroidal coils and at the redshift in light coming from distant galaxies. And I think if they looked at it and just thought about what they were seeing, they would see that there was a third field there. And and that's why in the appendix of Book 3, that's why I put in that scientific paper. The tall whites have a very dry sense of humor, and when you were talking with them, they loved to tease a person or to play jokes on them. For example, one time I asked the lady known as the teacher where they came from, and she said to me, "Do I know the names that they use when they talk about the stars?" And I said, "No, I don't." And she said, "So if we told you, you still wouldn't know where we came from." And I said, "That's true." And she said, "So why do you want to know where we come from?" And then they all laughed at me because they'd all outthought me, and they thought that was funny.
Do you suppose they have an agenda here that they're concealing?
It didn't seem that way to me. It seemed like it seemed to me like the base that they have up in the mountains. It seemed to me like one of their primary purposes was to have a base where they could repair and refuel the deep spacecraft, and that the ones that I saw or talked to, their primary goal was simply to keep the spacecraft. It was like going down to an airport where the primary goal is to keep the airplanes flying. And the primary goal.
When you say refuel, what did they use? Do you know what they were doing? What fuel they were using?
Well, as you see in my books, their spacecraft have a double hull construction, and so, for example, the scout craft, which are built here on this Earth, using materials given to them by the U.S. Air Force, in between the inner hull and the outer hull, I estimated there was like 1,000 miles of fiber optic windings, and then what they have is subatomic particle generators, and I'm not sure which subatomic particle they're using, but then they create a particular subatomic particle, and it's one of the easy ones. It's like one of the mesons or one of the baryons, one of the easy ones, and then they send it down through the fiber optics. And so the spacecraft behaves in a manner similar to the way, say, an electromagnet would behave. You know how to build an electromagnet, we might take insulated copper wire and wind it in a coil and then send an electric current through it and magnify and come up with a really strong magnetic field. Well, they're doing the very same thing for the anti-gravity field. They've picked a particle, and it's my understanding that there's 3 that are real easy to produce and a total of 5 that are commonly used because they're easy to produce, and there's a total of 7 or 9 which are not too hard to produce. And when you design a spacecraft, you pick one of them. I don't know which one, and then that's what you're running in the windings. And so, for example, in Book 2, in the chapter entitled 2 Games on One Board, the day that they had a coil meltdown on the scout craft, they didn't consider the scout craft to be particularly well made, by the way. What they had to do was to chop out all that fiber optics that had melted and put in, an emergency repair, so that they could get the scout craft back to the main hangar, where they could, back to base, so that they could do the more extensive repairs. And see, in Book 3, when the deep spacecraft came in, and I saw a number of deep spacecraft, arrive and leave from the base, but in Book 3, in the opening chapter, the one that came in with meteor damage, that it had the same construction, only it was designed so that you could get to all those coils from the inside without ever having to go outside the craft. Now, it's my understanding that the Roswell incident of 1947, that the little gray craft that crashed had a similar construction, had a double hull construction, and that what was laying on the desert was here in New Mexico was fiber optics.
Let me ask you a question, if I may, Charles, just for a moment. You say a ship came in with meteor damage?
That's correct. You'll see in Book 3 in the opening chapter. So the field that they have around the suits doesn't work for the ships then? Oh, it does, but like every force field, there's a limit to what it'll protect against. For example, in Book 3, in the chapter The End of Innocence, the night after the accident, and I was recovering it, and I was walking into the town of Indian Springs.
Well, tell us about the accident.
Well, let's see now, the meteor damage one?
Well, the accident that you were recovering from.
Well, that's described in Book 3 in the chapter The End of Innocence, where they have these weapons.
We're going to be back in just a moment.
Sure.
This is Whitley Strieber. It's Dreamland. We're back with Charles White, talking about the...
Charles Hall.
I finally did it. I knew I was going to do that at some point during the show. Charles Hall, talking about the tall whites. It really doesn't work when you're talking to Charles White about the tall halls. I know that. But, okay, so have you had any contact with them since your days on Nellis?
No. No, I haven't. When I left the ranges in May of '67 to go to Vietnam, all I brought off the ranges with was my memories. I didn't bring any diaries, any pictures, anything. Although, as you see in my books, when I was in Vietnam, there was a day in Vietnam when one of the Air Force colonels from the ranges came and wanted me to go back, and I would have, but I didn't want to re-enlist because I'm not that military, and I figured if I did my 4 years or 6 years, whatever the government requests, I didn't want to make the military a career because I'm not that military. And that was the last time I had any personal experience. However, I note that in September of 1968, in the so-called Nellis incident, and you'll have to look in old UFO books to find it, because it's one of those events that every time somebody publishes something like the Great Encyclopedia of UFO Stuff, it seems to be missing. But in September 1968, if you go back and look in the archives, you'll see that one of the scout craft sat down on the desert, about a mile from the Range 3 weather shack where I'd been. And you'll see in Book 3 that the guy after me had been burned, and so I was the last weather observer they were willing to send out there.
Now, you're referring to the Nellis UFO video of 1994, or? No,
the Nellis incident of September 1968. According to the number 2 man at Nellis, the base information officer, one of the scout craft sat down in the desert a mile from the Range 3 weather shack, which was deserted at the time, and sat there for a week, and whenever you would walk out towards it, a human would come out from the scout craft, and the tall whites could be seen staying at the craft itself and would meet you halfway, and they wanted to know when I was coming back. And according to my friends in the Weather Service who were working at the weather station in that year, the base commander came over and wanted to know where I was, and I was no longer in the Air Force. I was back in Madison, Wisconsin. And after a week, the best the number 2 man could do is he collected up the records, copies of the records of 5 people. One of them was me, and took them out there and gave them to the human who came off the scout craft. And
Have you ever seen the 1994 Nellis UFO video?
I won't say that I have. I've tried to follow it, and I've seen a lot of videos, but I won't. But right at the minute, I can't bring it to mind.
Okay, because the object in it is very well defined. You can see it. It's quite an unusual shape. You would have recognized it. So tell me what the ships looked like.
The scout craft were ellipsoidal. They were white. The scout craft was chalk white, and it looked like a giant Airstream trailer, or perhaps like the engine on a passenger train, smooth and rounded, because it was streamlined for high-speed travel. And the deep spacecraft looked the same way. It was just much, much larger, and the deep spacecraft was black. The deep spacecraft, they came, because the scout craft were built here on the Earth, they came with a number of different variations or models, However, the deep spacecraft came in at least 3 different sizes. Now, the hangar entrance up in the mountains, I measured that with my theodolite from a distance, and it was between 50 and 90 feet tall, and it was also between 350 and 500 feet wide. The largest of the deep spacecraft just barely fit in the opening. The main hangar had concrete doors that opened and closed in sections by raising up, and the largest of the deep spacecraft were about twice as long as they were wide. And so the largest of them were about between 350 and 500 feet wide, and between 600 and 1,000 feet long, and between 50 and 90 feet tall. Now, the smallest of the deep spacecraft were about half of that, and so when the smaller ones came in, and they came around on a 2-monthly schedule, every month there were deep spacecraft arriving and leaving. For the smaller ones, they only had to open about half of the doors, and they didn't have to raise them all the way up. There was a size in between the smallest and the largest, where they had to open all the door, like 3/4 of the doors, and they had to open them all the way up. Those were the deep spacecraft were titanium black. And the closest I ever got to a deep spacecraft is the one described in Book 3, in the night when it came in with meteor damage, and it was coming past me as I was standing on the balcony of the control tower down at Range 1. And it was hard to judge the distance, it was at night in the snow, but I would put it at no more than 200 feet out there. It was because when it was coming by, it had to come by real close, and you could see through the windows. Inside, it had a construction similar to that of a cruise ship. Because the older tall whites are much taller, as they get older, they grow, and some of them can be 8.5 feet tall or so. The decks between the floors, the distance between the floors, is much more than what you'd think for in a cruise ship. So the decks were perhaps 12 or maybe even 15 feet apart. But inside, the walls were done with something that looked like aluminum or an aluminum alloy. And they had, cross hatches and, just like a cruise ship does. And then you had the standard double hull with the inner hull and the outer hull and the windings in between them. But then inside the inner hall, you had another row of supply rooms where food and supplies and replacement parts and stuff were kept. And then inside that, then that was like all around the outside of the ship. And then inside that was the living areas. And then the children on board, they were in the middle towards the back where the engines are. There were no windows in the back, and there were no windows on top, and no windows in the bottom. There were running lights, and of course in the front was the cockpit, and there were windows in the front. And the scout craft had a similar construction, just on a smaller scale. When you looked at the scout craft, you had the so-called standard RV model. And so, for example, the one that I describe in Book 2 that I was on, that the teacher showed me, and Range 4 Harry showed me, their purpose in showing me the scout craft wasn't to anything to do with me per se. It was that one of their motivations was that in the days before, one of my friends who had seen them out at Range 4 thought that they were monsters or that they were mutants, and thought that that I must be risking my life to be around them the same way that you'd risk your life to be around a monster or a mutant. And of course, because they could tell what you were thinking because of their communication equipment, even when they were some distance away, the teacher was apparently afraid that if I thought of her and the children as monsters or mutants, then the children wouldn't be welcome to play when I was releasing my balloons. And so her purpose seemed to be to show me that they were just perfectly ordinary people, if you will, who just happened to have come here from another star. And that if they said I could trust them, then I could trust them, and so on. And so she was apparently trying to show me that they were just ordinary creatures, not monsters. And so, and that was apparently one of her motivations for showing me the scout craft, was showing, because at the time I was saying, well, gee, I think they're ordinary people that came here from another star. And my friend was saying, but how could you ever get here from another star? What physics would you use? How would you ever build a craft like that? And so it seemed like the teacher was just trying to show me that it was perfectly possible to build a craft and come to the Earth from another star and do perfectly ordinary things.
Let me ask you another question, if I may.
Sure.
They interacted with you in part to amuse their children, and they've been here since at least the time of James Madison. In the past, as I alluded to earlier, there were lots of Native Americans, not lots, but there were 2 or 3 tribes of Native Americans moving through that area on a fairly regular basis. But remember, this is the high desert, and it was not heavily populated, so we have that to remember. But one would have thought that the tall whites might have come into contact with Indians, and yet there is nothing in any of no remaining legendary deposit about them at all.
Well, now, here in New Mexico, Las Cruces, New Mexico, is in Dona Ana County. And the legend of the so-called ghost of Dona Ana County goes back to the time of the earliest Spaniards. The Indians, when the earliest Spaniards came to New Mexico back in the 1500s, and the early 1600s, the Indians outside Las Cruces claimed that there was a ghost whose description matches perfectly with, say, the teacher or any of the tall whites when they're wearing their suits at night.
Interesting. That I did not know.
And see, one of my theories is that, remember when I first came across them, the reason it was called Dreamland is because when you come across them at night in the desert, you think you're dreaming. I was told that it was called Dreamland because of what it does to your mind when you come into close encounter contact, as it makes your mind does all kinds of crazy stuff, which I went through for years. Listen, Charles,
I hate to tell you this, listeners who aren't subscribers, because we've come to the end of Dreamland, and we're certainly going to be continuing with Charles and Jerry Zeitlin, who's got a lot of interesting stuff to say, including a possible sighting of a tall white in Las Vegas, California, of all places. Maybe and maybe not. Las Vegas, Nevada. Boy, I'm really on my feed today. Okay, so next up on Dreamland, Linda Moulton Howe. You're about to experience something that you just can't get elsewhere. Emmy award-winning science reporter Linda Moulton Howe reporting on the absolute leading edge of science, discovery, and the true mysteries of the unknown. Don't miss her website, earthfiles.com, the one science website that tells you the secrets and gives you the facts that others dare not. earthfiles.com. Today she's reporting for us on the amazingly high activity level of the sun during what is supposed to be a solar minimum. Here she is from Albuquerque, Linda Moulton Howe.
Thanks, Whitley. You know, that sun in our solar system is a big ball of hydrogen and helium gas that's 107 times larger than the Earth. The sun is like a big nuclear fusion reactor that gives enough light and heat for some of these planets, like ours, to have surface life, even though our planet is 93 million miles from the sun. Scientists who have studied ice cores report that long before the current industrial age emissions of greenhouse gases that are definitely warming Earth, there have been many cycles of heating and cooling on this planet. Could it be that the so-called solar constant is not so constant? Could cycles in the sun from lots of sunspots and big solar flares to few sunspots and small solar flares have a lot to do with Earth temperatures, perhaps more than originally thought? NASA has reported that in the late 1970s, the amount of solar radiation that the sun emits during times of quiet sunspot activity, which is what we're supposed to be in now, has actually increased by nearly 0.05% per decade. This trend is important, and Richard Wilson, a researcher affiliated with NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies and Columbia University's Earth Institute, says, quote, historical records of solar activity indicate that solar radiation has been increasing since the late 19th century. If a trend comparable to the one found in this study persisted throughout the 20th century, it would have provided a significant component of the global warming over the past 100 years. But what makes the sun fluctuate in its energy output, and why should solar minimums be increasing at a rate of 0.05% per decade? Well, that's a big question, and it is still not understood. The solar cycle most of us have heard about is the solar maximum and the solar minimum, which averages 11 years. Back in the mid-1990s was the last solar minimum when sunspots were low in number. Now, in 2005 to 2006, the sun is again supposed to be at solar minimum. But in February this year, and most recently in September, there have been large X-class solar flares. In fact, the fifth largest solar flare on record occurred on September 7th, followed by 9 more large X-class flares over the next 12 days. What was astounding to solar physicists is that all of the X-class flares came from the same sunspot. In August, it was called 798. As it traveled behind the sun for a couple of weeks, it grew stronger, and as it emerged for the first time again on the face of the sun with the new name 808, it let loose with that huge X-17 that caused problems with GPS systems and produced northern lights all the way to Arizona. Solar physicists are puzzled about why the sun is generating so many large flares when it is supposed to be at its minimum, which means it should be quiet with very few sunspots and certainly very few flares. The solar physics group leader at NASA Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama, is David Hathaway, Ph.D. He was monitoring sunspot 798 even while it was behind the sun with sound and X-rays.
When we first saw it back in August, it had just started growing, the disk of the sun, and then again, as the sun rotates in about 27 days, it disappeared off of the western edge of the sun as you viewed the sun in the sky onto the backside. We knew it was still big on the backside because we could see its effects on the sound waves on the sun. When it came back around, even before we could see it on the eastern limb of the sun, it was flaring. That you could see X-rays coming from the upper parts of loops even before we could actually see the spot itself. As it rotated into view, we could see that it was continuing to grow in size, and in fact, it looked like part of the reason it's as energetic in producing flares is that new magnetic loops have popped up where the old ones were, and they're terribly tangled up as far as it's a very complicated situation as far as the magnetic fields there, and that's always a major ingredient towards producing things like solar flares and coronal mass ejections.
And I understand it's a little bit like winding up rubber bands and then letting them snap.
A bit, yeah. That magnetic fields are very much like rubber bands, except that they don't break the same way. A magnetic field never has a loose end, but you can basically short-circuit them if you twist them so they cross. Where they cross, they can reconnect there and form two loops instead of one, and in the process give off a great deal of energy, the energy equivalent of millions of megatons of TNT.
Since I talked with you in February about all of the solar flares that were coming then from what was known as sunspot 720, and now we're talking about August and September 2005, just a few months later, of sunspot 798 and 808 being so active and ending up with the fifth largest flare on record. 2005 to 2006 is supposed to be solar minimum.
This cycle seems to be a little odd, and I say that with reservations because we don't, as far as looking at X-rays, we've only been doing it for about 30 years now, so we don't have a lot of experience with how many X-ray type flares occur during a cycle. But this one is definitely very different from the last two in having a lot of activity. Down, as it's decreasing towards minimum, still producing a lot of big flares. Certainly, it raises questions about, whether this cycle is different from others with regard to these explosive events, to the flares. But what appears to be the odd thing this cycle is that even though the number of spots are small and the total area of the sun covered in spots is small as it's heading towards minimum, the spots are still producing lots of flares and lots of big flares.
And what's the speculation or hypothesis about why this is happening?
My first guess would be that the magnetic fields that we know are the cause of these flares are just more complicated for some reason in the spots this time around than they were, for example, during the decline of the last cycle. Back in the late 90s or mid 90s.
And what would make the magnetic fields more complicated?
I don't know. That's an excellent question. But the way sunspots are formed is that loops of magnetic field rise up from deep inside the sun, and when they erupt through the surface, they make sunspots. And being loops, you'll have one set of spots where you have the field coming out of the sun, and another set of spots where the field's going in. And it looks like that's what we had for this region, when it was 798 as we first saw it on the sun. And what it looks like what happened, as far as the way I interpret the data, is that another loop came up in the same spot and the two of them have been fighting basically and crossing their magnetic field lines and exploding in the process. So I think that's what appears to have happened in this particular case.
Well, is it strange enough that you and other solar physicists are talking about this and comparing notes about what might be happening and where might all of this be headed?
Indeed, yeah. In fact, my own group here, we're having a meeting on Wednesday morning, and part of the reason for the meeting is to just let's talk about this group and what happened to it and see if we can understand it.
And where is 808 right now?
It's just about off of the western edge of the sun again. It's decreased a lot in size in the last 4 or 5 days, so it looks like it's certainly on its decline now, whereas the last time we saw it rotate off of the western edge of the sun, it was growing in size. This time it's getting smaller. There have been flares in the last few days, but they haven't been the big X-class flares that we saw earlier. So it looks like it's going to stay away, and we may not see much left of it come 2 weeks from now when it comes back around again.
Has there ever been a time in solar records in which there have been 9 X-solar flares between, say, September 7th and the 19th? That's only 12 days.
We don't have a lot of observations since we've only been observing X-rays from the sun like this for the last 30 years. We only have 3 cycles to look at, and certainly if we look at those 3 cycles, this one's different. There's no doubt about it. But that doesn't say that there was a similar cycle to this, in the previous 3 or the previous 10. So that's where just having a small number to look at, it's hard to reach conclusions as to how odd this might be.
Well, if this is different in the end of 2005 as we go into 2006, and 2006 technically was supposed to be the bottom of the cycle, the most minimum, what is your projection now for what the next solar maximum might be like by 2010, 11, and 12?
That's an excellent question, and if you ask me my own opinion, I'll give you one answer. You ask another solar astronomer, you're apt to get another answer. In fact, my own impression in looking at the solar phenomenon that I do look at to try to tell me what's going to happen for the next cycle, I think it's going to be a big cycle. But some of my colleagues, looking at other characteristics of the sun, think that it's going to be a small one. So. And this has traditionally been a very difficult thing within solar physics, predicting the size of the next solar maximum. Once a cycle has started, we're usually pretty good, but before they start, it's traditionally been very difficult to peg the size of them.
If this next solar maximum is really big and has lots of X flares in it, how much damage could be done to our entire global positioning system and satellites?
Well, the satellite makers are getting better at designing their instruments to be somewhat safeguarded from the effects of solar flares. But nonetheless, the energetic particles that the sun does produce in the process of producing a solar flare can take out electronics on satellites. If it's a big cycle, the atmosphere, the Earth's atmosphere expands as it heats up and causes satellite drag that can bring down satellites earlier than their prescribed lifetime. So if it's a big cycle, we're apt to see more of that as far as satellites losing electronics, sometimes critical electronics that totally disables them, and also satellites that deorbit, that spiral into the Earth's atmosphere earlier than expected. The danger, though, comes from the radiation itself and what it does to electronic components, and it's not so much that it melts things, but that you get energetic particles, protons and alpha particles, helium nuclei. They can go crashing through electronic components and knock around the atoms within the component and destroy their functionality.
Okay, then the significance of our looking at a solar maximum in which there may be a lot of X flares upcoming in the next 6, 7, 8 years would be that if it is really intense, it's the number of energetic particles that will be impacting the satellites, and that is what could do damage.
Yes.
And what about magnetic fields themselves? We know about auroras that are caused by geomagnetic storms. Is the coronal mass ejection and its interaction with the Earth's magnetic field, does that magnetic field disruption cause problems?
Certainly it does. That not only as you just mentioned does it cause beautiful things like the aurora, it can cause damaging things such as surge of current through power lines that can take out transformers and circuit breakers in big power distribution systems, so that you can get blackouts, for instance, due to some of these big flares.
So the worst case would be what?
Worst case would be something similar to what we saw back in March of '89, where there was a $10 million transformer in New Jersey that was literally fried by the surge of current through power lines, and the province of Quebec lost power, and there were some people there that didn't have power restored for 6 days in the waning days of winter up there. So worst case is things like that happening. Right? And then there's, again, the loss of satellites that occurs when big flares go off.
Does a lot of it have to do with the exact direction that the sunspot is in relationship to the Earth?
It does. As I said, this big one happened just as the sunspot was coming into view. So you can think of it as basically it's aiming away from us. It's aiming out towards the side, more or less.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that we saw a big increase in the radiation environment around the Earth from it, that was even more of a surprise than seeing the flare itself. The fact that this occurred at a position on the sun that normally doesn't influence us, and yet in this case it certainly did.
And if it had been aimed directly at the Earth, what do you think would have happened?
They'd be seeing aurora in Florida.
When will we know if the sun is going to be a maximum with lots and lots of solar flares, or this opposite theory that it might become exceptionally quiet?
We ought to have certainly a better measure of the next solar cycle within the next couple of years. Even within the next year, if we start to see lots of new spots to the new cycle coming out as minimum approaches, then that's a good indicator that the next cycle will be a large and active cycle. On the other hand, there are these strange things that we don't quite understand, where in this case we have a cycle that isn't so big when you look at sunspot numbers or areas or other indicators of solar activity, yet if you look at flares, it's been quite active.
Mm-hmm. And that is the puzzle to solar physicists right now.
That's the puzzle at the moment, is why is such a wimpy cycle so strong when it comes to making flares?
And as solar physicists argue about different theories of what will happen with the sun between now and 2012, some are even placing money bets. Russian scientists at the Institute of Solar Terrestrial Physics have laid a $10,000 bet with British government climate experts. The Russians claim that in the next 10 years, the Earth will face global cooling. But the English scientists say that the climate will become warmer and warmer, just as Dr. Hathaway thinks that we're going to enter a time of increasing sunspots and probably a lot more X-flares. Now, recently, Russia's Pravda newspaper interviewing the physicists in Russia who have placed this bet with the English solar physicists quoted, "It is hard to predict who will win. It would be great if both sides lost and the Earth stayed the same. However, at the moment, scientists cannot understand what is happening with the sun," unquote. And it is, Whitley, I think, kind of important at this juncture with the sun not behaving in any fashion that solar physicists understand. to go back to the 1700s, that's when the solar activity reached a minimum, the so-called Maunder minimum. In fact, astronomers reported then not seeing any sunspots on the sun for a long period. And at the same time, there was a powerful volcanic eruption that spread a layer of dust in the atmosphere, and that produced what is now called the Little Ice Age in the 1720s. Well, it's hard to fathom how, out of all of this activity on the sun, that it could go completely the opposite direction.
Well, folks, all I can say is this. Dreamland starts out with the phrase, "Welcome to the edge of the world." I ain't kidding. That's where we all live right now.
But really, I was supposed to be off at San Angels. I went down to the base, to the accountant office, and I said, asked why I wasn't getting paid. And the next day at weather school, two MPs showed up with the dogs, actually, and took me off to the base commander's office, and he stood me up there and he said, "Airman Hall, if you have a set of orders showing that you're supposed to be on this base, then you're a happy man, and the captain who gave them to you will get 5 years in Leavenworth. You're too valuable a man to be risked in weather school. And if you don't have a copy of your orders, then the captain will be a happy man, and you'll get 5 years in Leavenworth. You're too valuable a man to be risked here in weather school." And I had 2 copies. I was real fast. I had them on my wallet, and I was real fast at giving him a copy. And so then they sent me back to weather school and gave the captain, and the captain that was supposed to have given me the real orders, he, as I understand it, he was he was court-martialed. And so then they sent me to Nellis Air Force Base outside Las Vegas. I finished weather observing school. And at the time, so I got in Nellis in March of '65. And at the time, weather observers did 6 weeks TDY and rotated between Nellis and the Nellis gunnery ranges at Indian Springs. And at the time, they all came back with stories. One was the legend of Range 4 Harry, which I talk about in book 1. But you weren't supposed. I wasn't supposed to be in the rotation scheme till I finished my on-the-job training, which usually takes like several months. And I got there in March, and in late April, of the same year when I was at Nellis, my commander, they called him over to the base commander called him over to his office one day and said the Pentagon wants Charlie to be sent next. And then I remember when the major, when he came back from the base commander's office, he was looking kind of stunned or shocked, and he was saying, gee, you have friends in the Pentagon, and of course, I just grabbed.
Is that specter of spousal abuse? There's so many questions that raises. We just couldn't leave that one alone.
Well, no.
We rarely go after individuals from open SETI, but this one was just impossible to ignore.
Well, yeah, and Seth Shostak is I don't know. I think since I'm not a member of SETI, and I don't care whether I go after people or not, I think the simplest word to describe him would be creep. And so that's my reading of the validity of him as a person, and I think that SETI is a waste of time and money, frankly.
If you actually if you find the article link from our homepage, and then within that article at the very top, you'll get to to a news story about what Seth Shostak said. He has his own picture there, and there's a little bit of a background on him. And you don't really have to explain why he's a creep. All you have to do is read his own stuff, and it comes out loud and clear. But we do have other information about Seth Shostak. I'm just waiting for the right moment.
Well,
he's as bad as you think.
Of course, to be honest, we're going to be talking here today not about Seth Shostak and SETI, which is but you talk about pouring from the empty into the void. It's a waste of time to even think about them, in my opinion. Although, thank goodness, there are people like Jerry and Malou Zeitlin out there keeping them honest, or keeping them at least calling them to task. They can't be kept honest because they're not honest. Now, Charles, I want to get into the tall whites, and I want to begin with your beginning with this, and not quite with when you first encountered them, but you went for a long time without even mentioning their existence to your wife. What was the process that brought you to change your position and to begin to talk about this?
Well, to begin with, the first time I mentioned it to my wife was shortly after we were married in 1970. We had been, my wife and I were married in November 1969, and we were in Sacramento, California, and we went to a party. And on the way, and at the party, people had, I'd been a weather observer in the Air Force, and I'd been stationed at Nellis and at Indian Springs, Nevada, and also in Vietnam. And at the party, some of the other members of the party had implied that that the Air Force guys and stuff that they'd had pretty easy duty. And on the way home, I began telling my wife about the tall white aliens that I had encountered out in the deserts north of Indian Springs, because it was a very emotional experience. As you remember, the 1970s, 60s and 70s. That was, at a time when UFOs were supposed to be swamp gas. And after I told my wife some of my experiences, she said that she what she cared about was how she should behave if she ever met one. And so really my wife, there wasn't actually a long time frame that I wasn't, before I told my wife. When I was in the Air Force, I enlisted in the Air Force in July of 1964, and I went to Vietnam in May of 1967, and I was discharged in May of 1968. There was never a time that I wasn't telling the people around me. It's just that I found that trying to capture the emotion of how it was to be out there in the desert and encounter the extraterrestrials, and I found that I couldn't really capture that emotion and convey it to my listeners or to the people I was talking with using the spoken word, and that's why eventually I came to write my books.
Well, it's an interesting statement, because it's also a very familiar problem to me, one I was just been wrestling with in the past few days, when I've begun to try to describe, I think, is a much more appropriate word but there is reason to think that maybe there's something in it, because for our subscribers, we're going to be talking to a very well-respected researcher, Jerry Zeitlin, who may have encountered such a being in a casino in Laughlin, Nevada. And as you listen, you'll find there are reasons why they might show up in such places. It's all very bizarre and very strange, but nevertheless, I would not have kept an open mind about what happened to me if it hadn't happened to me. So believe you me, I'm keeping an open mind about Charles Hall. We'll be right back.
You are listening to Whitley Strieber's Dreamland online and on the IBC Radio Network.
Today we're talking to Charles Hall and Jerry Zeitlin. Charles is a most interesting gentleman. He was on Coast in January, I believe, talking about something he calls the Tall Whites. And it's a story we're going to get into in a slightly different way, as you may imagine, from you have heard it before on Coast, because of the fact that I come from a similar background in a way, and that I've had close encounters as well, although never with this particular these particular beings. Joining us also is Jerry Zeitlin. Jerry is the I don't know, we call some people denizens of their websites, and his website and his organization is openseti.org. It's a wonderful organization. It places pressure on SETI to change its whole methodology, to open itself to the possibility of contact. And in view of the fact that Seth Shostak was recently at the Bohemian Grove in Northern California, claiming that abductees were probably the victims of spousal abuse, they they're far from where you want them to be, Jerry, I would think.
Well, we certainly are, and Malou, my wife Malou, has an article about that on our website that we put up in the last week. It's really shocking that he can rate
my website, because I can't document things that have happened to me in recent years, things that are so fundamentally different from what we think of as experience that it's impossible to describe. But let me now ask you this. We'll lead into this slowly. Where did you came back from Vietnam? You had no idea about these creatures in Vietnam, I would guess. Is that true? Or
no. In May of 1964, I enlisted in the U.S. Air Force, and in July of 1964, I enlisted in the U.S. Air Force, and I was sent to Lackland Air Force Base, San Antonio, for my basic training. In those days, we still did 13 weeks, and so I was at Lackland through July, August, September 1964. I remember there was a really bad, just a terrible thunderstorm in September of 64, and I was walking area guard that night during the storm. It tore up a big tree. I got an award for walking area guard, while the other area guards got a couple weeks in the brig for hiding under the tree because the storm was so horrible. And then, when they get, you know how the Air Force gives you tests to see what you're good at. And I got a perfect score in logical reasoning, inductive reasoning and deductive reasoning, and I also got only one wrong in the math ability test, which was 500 questions, much harder than the graduate record exam. And so I was supposed to be in a security job, radio intercept analysis. So me and two of my friends did PATS standings, waiting for our security clearance to come through. My clearance came through, but the guy that was the clerk at the squadron office screwed up my orders and instead gave me the cover orders, which were to go to weather school at Chanute instead of to go to security school at San Angelo, Texas. And so after I'd been at Chanute for 2 months, and I hadn't been paid because I had 2 copies of my orders, but nobody knew I was there. You know how the military is. I had copies of my orders so I could go out and get in the airplane and all that stuff.